few weeks ago, I was in a second-hand bookshop. It happened to be a Linen Hall bookshop in Belfast, which seems to be moving around as it finds different premises for different books. And depending when you go in there, you can find whole collections of good Catholic books. Maybe they're clearing out some convent or some house or something, and they all land in there at once. And other times there's not much there. But anyway, there was this book called Jesus by Edward Schillebeeckx, Father Edward Schillebeeckx, Dominican. And, I was there looking at the book. I know who this author is. I just have never read any of his books. And anytime I've heard of him, it's kind of, one of these liberal Dutch theologians, or I think he was Flemish, but he's had a lot of influence in Belgium and Netherlands, especially before, during, and after the council. So I was just wondering, do I buy this book or not? And I said, well, look, it's an experiment on Christology, which is the study of Christ. And I'm just going to read you out who Edward Schillebeeckx was. He was born in Antwerp, Belgium in 1914, entered the Dominican order in Ghent in 1934, and was ordained a priest in Louvain in 1941. Continued his studies at the Dominican house of Les Saulchours near Paris, while at the same time taking courses in l'École de Haute Études at the Sorbonne and a course of biblical exegesis in the College of France. In 1956, he became professor of Higher Institute of the Study of Religion in the Catholic University of Louvain, and in 1959 a Master of Theology. In 1957, Professor Schillebeeckx succeeded to the chair of theology and history of theology in the Catholic University of Nijmegen, where he helped to found and edit the, I'm not going to pronounce that, and the world-renowned Concilium, being in charge of the Dogmatic section of that journal. As theological advisor of the Dutch Episcopate, Professor Schillebeeckx attended the Second Vatican Council. He holds an honorary doctorate in the Universities of St. Louis, Chicago, and Louvain. He is also the author of Mission of the Church, The Understanding of the Faith in Christ, The Christian Experience in the Modern World. His writings, and particularly Jesus, An Experiment of Christology, have made Edward Schillebeeckx the subject of inquiry by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. And I think they had a few investigations into his writings. But, who was Jesus for Father Edward Schillebeeckx? I mean, he's a religious, a Dominican who's, been privileged to have so much access to so many hours or days, years of study, libraries, a whole world to understand Christ is, and who is this Christ that he found? I did read some of his book, and actually I went back and I was able on the internet to get other books of his to try and get a clearer picture of who Christ is. I'm just going to read you something here. It's on page 258. The distinctive relation of Jesus to God was expressed in the primitive Christian churches, more especially by the use of the honorific title of Son of God and the Son. These were Christian identifications of Jesus of Nazareth after his death. Jesus never spoke of himself as the Son or Son of God. There is no passage in the synoptics pointing to this direction. In that direction, what is certain is that he referred in a special way to God as Abba, to recover something of Jesus' own relationship to God. Therefore, we are thrown back on Jesus' message and manner of his life and his prophetic self-understanding, which can also be regarded as a settled fact of history. In other words, we have to depend on what first sight might be called indirect evidence. Actually, this fits well with the anthropological insight that whether for himself or for others, it is only in his actions that a man is finally to be understood. For although Jesus never posited himself beside the rule of God as the second subject of his proclamation, in the business that occupied him and with which he identified himself, he also revealed his self-understanding. This is not a blind spot for us within the luminous revelation of his message and praxis. If the rule of God as proclaimed by Jesus assumes a definitive form and aspect of his own conduct and way of life, then there is already a detachable relation, albeit one requiring further delimitation, between the actual person of Jesus, his message and his behavior, and then his person is never entirely separate from his message and ministry. In a post-Easter confessional way of speaking, it is possible to affirm a priori that Jesus is God's great act of salvation in this world, and on that basis we can go on to interpret that what he said and what he did. This is a way of talking about Jesus based on an attempt to identify him and to understand his life as a totality. But our purpose is, with his disciples, as it were, to follow the way of Jesus of Nazareth right up to his death, so as in that way, and again, as it were, to trace for ourselves how the faith-inspired interpretation of Jesus of Christ came into being. Secondly, we are looking for traces of the life of Jesus that, for us as for the disciples, could constitute an invitation to assent in faith to what is indeed God's great work of salvation in Jesus of Nazareth. The result is not to legitimize our faith, but it does mean that we keep a critical watch on legitimate emergence or persistence of definitively Christian belief. To go in search of the original and unique centre of somebody's religious experience is highly precarious understanding. That is true, if the person gives direct expression of his private experiences, something which Jesus never does, to judge from the available sources of knowledge about him. For then we have a problem in telling what may be the relationship between the authentic element of the experience and its clarifying interpretation, as the two are of course intrinsically intertwined without conceding in a self-evident or transient identity. And B, when somebody does not articulate what such experiences directly, but speaks about God and his cause in such a way that by doing so he imitates or discloses his personal religious relationship to God. This is a difficult task, especially in the case of religious experience, because we are trying to penetrate to the very mystery of a personal being. We are asked after whatever it is with which he identifies his heart, his mind, his life, his whole being as a person, and which gives him life, his life, its synthesis. In other words, after what constitutes him, that particular person, provides grounds for this being a person. Now that the mystery of each person is only accessible to us by his behavior, which on the other hand is just an inadequate sign of the person manifesting himself in it and at the same time conceals him. It is more than his several actions, and yet it is disclosed only in this activity. It does not stop us from acquiring through these acts a slant of the mystery of the person of another individual human being within the insuperable ambivalence of our history. Now, I read this text a few times trying to understand what Schillebeeckx was trying to say, and other parts of the book. Because if you've dedicated your whole life to this, what did Father Edward Schillebeeckx understand about Christ? Who was Christ for Schillebeeckx? It's just mind-boggling for me when somebody has all of these resources, all of this time, all the amount of prayer, the sacraments. I mean, he's in a whole world surrounded by all of the tools to know Christ. And yet when I read his book, An Experiment on Christology, all I see, the image, the only thing I see is this priest dressed in a lab coat in a laboratory studying an object under a microscope and trying to understand it. And it's just a weird experience to see. I don't think he was a bad I don't think he's a bad person, in the sense that I don't think he was intentionally trying to set out to on a project to harm people. But I suppose the question I'm asking is, who is Jesus for Edward Schillebeeckx? If you read other authors like Saint Teresa of Calcutta, her spiritual life, or John of the Cross, or you read Teresa of Avila's works, her biography, and then The Interior Castle, which are written 10 years apart from each other. So these works. Or, for example, more modern writers like Ralph Martin, Fulfillment of All Desire, and Ralph talking about his experience that day in an airport in Geneva. You know, reading different people's journey into union with God, you feel you understand the two people working. Or recently, another person I've been reading is Fernando Riello, and his journey, his experience, and then what he's trying to communicate to us. Christ isn't a dead figure from 2,000 years ago, just sitting in whatever resources we have available to understand about him. Christ is alive and has been continuously communicating and purposely guiding the church for the last 2,000 years. And I think when theology so separates itself so far from the mystical element of our faith, which is, you know, our theology should come from a position of we're studying God who we've encountered, God who we have united ourselves to, the God that has revealed himself to us in contemplation, in the sense that it should be that experience from there to go out and do theology. But oftentimes we sit at a distance and trying to do theology without actually having done the journey to union with God. It's interesting because when the church is weak, and in different periods of the church, Christ does reveal himself. And I'm going to go back to Maria Valtorta, to the last chapter of the poem of the Man God. I'm just going to read you something here. Jesus says, "For reasons that have induced me to enlighten and dictate episodes and words of mine to little John are, in addition to the joy of communicating an exact knowledge of me to this loving victim soul manifold. But the moving spirit of all of them is my love for the church, both teaching and militant, and my desire to help souls in their ascent towards perfection. The knowledge of me helps to ascend. My word is life. I maintain the main reasons. The main reasons maintained in the dictation of the 18th of January 1947, in which little John will put them here integrally. This is the most important reason, because you are perishing and I want to save you. The most profound reason for the gift of this work is that in the present time, when modernism, condemned by my holy vicar Pope Pius X, becomes corrupted in more and more harmful doctrines, the church represented by my vicar may have further material to fight against those who deny the supernaturalness of the dogmas, the divinity of Christ, the truth of the Christ God and man, real and perfect, both in the faith and in history, and has been handed down to him, Gospels, Acts of the Apostles, Apostolic Letters, tradition, etc. And one thing, when you read Schillebeeckx, the divine nature of Christ becomes very confused. It's almost like he's nearly saying he's a prophet. His prophetic life. You know, you don't have to go far into his writings when you're wondering, who is Jesus for him? like, who is? Oh, well, he never referred to himself as Son of God. This is something that the Christians have applied to him afterwards. You know, it's just, as I said, my whole gist of this podcast is to kind of ask the church, our theology has to be founded on scriptures, but also it has to be founded on the mystical element of our faith. It has to come from a place, okay, we do theology standing on the top of the hill, having attained as much as possible union with Christ, having let ourselves to be transformed by God as much as possible on our journey towards union with God, as Saint Teresa of Avila speaks about. Theology has to be done in the seventh mansion. From that point of view. Otherwise, what type of theology does it ever end up being? Because you cannot speak about your experience. And you're not able to tie in your experience with the facts of our faith. I think it's a bit high for me to be doing this video because I am not a theologian. Okay? I am not an expert in this, but it always fascinated me when at 18 Christ says to me, it reveals his love to me, that I couldn't understand that experience. And I rejected that experience, saying, oh, no, this. And anytime I kind of approach it with experts in the church, okay, explain to me, how does this work? How do we experience the love of God? Well, and I explained to my experience and they wouldn't understand it. And then I would be confused. Did I really experience this? Is this real? Does God act in this way? Does God communicate in this way? And it took me a lifetime to realize, yes, God is love. God is love, and God wants to transform, and God wants to bring you to perfection, to ascend to the heights of perfection. He wants you to work on yourself, to convert, to renounce one way of living, and to start a new way of living, thinking, encountering. And so theology must be done from the hill. It must be done from the mountain. It can't be done from the valley. And this is what has happened. We have so much valley theology and not enough mountain theology in the church. And again, when you look at the life of Mother Teresa, Calcutta, okay, this woman speaks from experience. You know, we need theologians to speak of their experience. Not just putting Christ under a microscope and examining what we know about him as if it is some scientific study, because that's what it almost felt like. This is an exercise in historical science. I don't know. In 10, 15, 20 years, where will this Dominican sit in the history of Catholic study? It would be interesting. Just out of curiosity. I mean, it's he's an interesting figure. I would just love for the church to actually kind of chew on this. You know, when you read, for example, the letters of Padre Pio, another saint, widely regarded, you know, you've loved. You know, you talk about his experience. He talks about his experience. At certain moments, it seems to me that my soul is on the point of grasping the object of its desires, but who would believe it? The object of my torment suddenly hides from me and my hand, and I call cruel pushes me far away from it. Who can tell the weight of the hand which rejects me in this manner? If all the stars of the heaven were to rain down on my poor soul, in my opinion, they would not weigh so heavily upon me as does this repelling hand. All to this, the fact that my soul realizes that it has been rejected, and the judge for itself if one can continue to live for any length of time in such a state. Bear in mind, moreover, that this approach of my soul to the desired object and its subsequent rejection are continual, and then tell me if my state is an inevitable one. So you have Padre Pio bearing out his soul as God is purifying him, preparing him, stripping away and leading him. Exactly, really, what you see happening, what Teresa of Avila speaks about, And I think the church will be transformed by these great saints that will speak of their experiences, but has the church been transformed by the theologians who speak from the valley? I ask the question. Maybe somebody that knows more about this can enlighten me. But I just took up the moment of studying this priest, because he is so much spoken about. He had a great influence in the Dutch Catechism, which, as far as I remember, hasn't brought much fruits to the Catholic Church in Netherlands or Belgium. Probably the opposite. These people had so much influence. We need to study their legacy and learn from it. But I think in this millennium, our theology has to be done from the hill. It has to be done from a point of union with God. We need men and women to speak of their experience with union with God, so that they can from that point study theology, and to give us understanding of where God is what God is trying to do in His church in this new age. Anyway, God bless you. And let me know what you think in the comments. But I just thought I'd speak of this experience. Take care. Bye-bye.